You are listening to and streaming a More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai Quartey, and I'm honored to bring in a scholar who has spent his career studying exactly the machinery that we're talking about today, how power, race, punishment, how it all moves together. Dr. Calvin John Smiley is an associate professor of sociology at Hunter College at the City University of New York. Professor Smiley, welcome back to a More Perfect Union, my brother.
Hey, Dr. Nee, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing good. We have a heat wave over here, so I'm enjoying it.
I'm about to say, are you staying cool? Are you adhering to Mayor Mandami's request to keep your thermostat at 78?
No, not at all. Not at all. Until they start turning off those lights in Times Square and all of those big office buildings that lay dormant. No.
Just like a New Yorker. I love it. I love it.
We gotta be cool too.
Well, you ain't got no problem with that. Let's go across the Atlantic first, because I think most of our listeners have not been tracking what's happening in Belfast, and it should terrify us for reasons that have everything to do with what's brewing here. But for folks who are less familiar, earlier this month, a 44-year-old man was stabbed in Belfast, allegedly by a 30-year-old Sudanese asylum seeker. Video of the attack circulated online, and within days, riots broke out across Belfast. We're talking homes, businesses, and vehicles that were set afire, with masked men going door to door trying to identify which houses were occupied by immigrants. The Times called it spontaneous. Northern Ireland's justice minister said flatly it was fueled by online commentators who would struggle to find Belfast on a map. And here's the American angle. Enrico Tarrio, y'all might remember that name because he's the former head of the Proud Boys. He was convicted of seditious conspiracy for January 6th and later pardoned by President Trump. Well, guess what he did? He traveled to Belfast at the end of June, and he told our friends over at NPR that he's making a documentary. He said that he wants to get this exactly right, saying, quotes, "I don't condone the violence. I don't think it's the way. But when people feel a certain way, this reaction is a natural human reaction." Professor Smiley, the phrase "a natural human reaction" is doing a lot of work here. Talk to us about what does it mean when American extremist figures start treating a foreign riot as a rehearsal space? What's the through line between active clubs, these fascist youth fight club networks that NPR has been reporting on, and the movement politics we're watching metastasize here at home?
Certainly, and as you said, that it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. But once again, this is not something new, and it goes back to what we call moral panics, where people have utilized different fears and anxieties and tap into those to spur this kind of chaos in this what ultimately becomes violence. And so there are people who are already, what we might say, afraid of difference or fearful of change. And so you have folks who exploit that by creating these narratives like we saw in Belfast. But that happens here as well. Donald Trump actually did that by parading around mothers of sons who were killed by quote unquote undocumented immigrants, even though the data shows that that's much less. You are less likely to be killed by an undocumented immigrant than you are by an American citizen, or in a school shooting for that matter. But to directly answer your question, I think what we see here is that the idea of the American populace is a global sort of network, right? So what we do here certainly becomes pronounced globally, and globally people are watching what we're doing here. So there's probably multiple incentives for Enrique to travel. One, probably a financial one. I'm sure there's some sort of financier who's sending him there to create this documentary, but he is likely also there to sow other sorts of incendiary sorts of discontent amongst local populations, because if anyone has ever read anything about the US CIA, that's what they're really good at, is to go and destabilize other places, support coups, and then go in and the U.S. can bring freedom and control.
And that's exactly the pivot I want to make, because now let's bring this story home to Florida, where the mechanism, it looks a little different, but the target is still the same. Florida's State Board of Education, they voted this week to bar undocumented students from admission to the state's 28 public colleges, requiring every applicant, every last one of them, to prove citizenship or lawful presence before they can even enroll. Uh, the vote, um, the vote, and it's worth noting that none of the board members debated or discussed the public policy before voting. Dozens of public uh, commenters called in specifically to oppose it, and this is on top of Florida already stripping in-state tuition from undocumented students last year. About 49,000 undocumented students are currently enrolled in Florida higher ed, and roughly 8,000 undocumented students graduate from Florida high schools every single year. Kids who, in many cases, have been in the state since they were toddlers. And so, Professor, from a sociological lens, what does it do to a young person's sense of belonging, their identity formation, when the state itself, not an individual, the state itself tells them in writing, the door you walk through your whole life is now closed?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly creates a lot of fear, anxiety. Where can I go? Where do I fit in and have this belonging? And I think, as you bring up, um, there are people who've been here since they were toddlers, since they were babies. This is their country, right? For all intents and purposes of their cultural awareness and cultural acumen, they are an American in all respects, other than what the place of being birthed might mean, which, we can debate what are actual boundaries and borders, which are oftentimes imagined themselves, right? There's no set a boundary if you're in a plane like you see on a map where it says America, right? These are just kind of things that we as people have said should exist. And so, again, what we're seeing is this kind of continued onslaught on higher education, which is always in the kind of crosshairs of fascism, um, both in the United States and abroad, right? So when we think about who are the targets, it's typically those who are the most vulnerable. So it's undocumented folks, it's LGBTQIA plus folks, it's people of color, it's people of minoritized religions, and it keeps escalating. And so what we have to be really careful about is not doing the dismissive, well, it's not my community, or you should have come here the right way, as if a child has that option, or what is the right way is a whole debate in and of itself. But kind of really supporting your neighbors and supporting those around you, and making space for community and protecting those that are your friends and family.
And just to put a finer point on it, it's worth noting uh, on both sides of the Atlantic what's happening, right? And so the idea that immigrants, and specifically immigrants of color, are the acceptable political punching bag, right? There's no escaping that. And so for folks that are like, oh my gosh, maybe, we should just go live the expat life, in some other part of the world as if you can escape it. Well, good try, right? But the xenophobia is whipping up across the country and around the world, and you know in part because it is helping folks to put political points on the board. Folks are able to win elections, off the backs, of the xenophobia, off the backs of the anti-LGBTQ sentiment, anti-black sentiment.
Yeah, and I think what's often true is we often say, look at some of the more Scandinavian or Nordic countries as this place of aspiration. But even as they start to see higher rates of immigration from brown and black and Muslim countries, they are becoming much more reactionary, even in some of their criminal justice reforms, uh, instituting longer sentences, utilizing things like terrorism charges to really kind of roll back a lot of what we would have said is the kind of quote unquote standard. And so we have to think about what kind of world we want to live in and how we do this. And I think, to your point about like people saying, "Oh, I'll just be an expat," that is a very racialized and terminology, right? Immigrant is usually reserved for brown and black folks, but it also is one of class, where we can think about, do you actually have the privilege to pack up your bags and move you and your entire family to another country whereas many folks don't even have that luxury to think about the kind of financial, economic, social burden that would take to move. And so we have to think about that.
Professor Smiley isn't going anywhere when we come forward, including we're going to talk about the border wall. We're going to talk about, how it's about to eat $46 billion of your money, $46 billion of your tax dollars. And a mayor in New York who got dragged online saying the quiet part that Trump's own energy department already says. We're going to unpack all of that and more when we come forward. You're listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580 with the one and only Professor Calvin John Smiley. You are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. We're here with Professor Calvin John Smiley of Hunter College. Professor, let's talk about where all this energy and all this money is actually going, because I think people hear immigration policy and border wall as separate from their own daily lives. And you know, and I know it's not. The Associated Press is reporting today that the Trump administration's $46 billion with a B smart wall is racing ahead on the U.S.-Mexico border. We're talking about 30-foot steel fencing combined with sensors and cameras and surveillance towers. And here's the number that should stop you. This is happening while border crossings are at their lowest in decades. Ricky Garza with the Southern Border Communities Coalition put it plainly. He said, quotes, "We're seeing a massive expansion of surveillance and surveillance technology across the borderlands. $46 billion for a problem that by the government's own numbers is smaller than it's been in a generation." Professor, I want you to read on the asymmetry here. $46 billion for a wall that nobody's crossing gets a shrug. A mayor asking people to save $15 a month on their electric bill during a genuine emergency gets treated like the end of the republic. What does that asymmetry, what does it tell us about which government spending and which forms of government care get coded as normal and which get coded as radical?
Certainly. So it's always, when it comes to the military industrial complex or the prison industrial complex, which encompasses law enforcement and corrections, it is always a game of heads I win, tails you lose. And so in this case, the argument could be, yeah, well, the border crossings are at their lowest, so we need to fund it more to continue to drive those numbers down. And then if there's ever a point where the numbers go up, where there's a spike or there's some kind of event that catches national headlines, that then turns around and says, "See, it's a crisis, it's a chaos. We need more numbers." To your point about the broader surveillance, this is certainly a play for big tech, which we know Donald Trump and many in his administration and across the aisle are heavily invested in. And so, money's got to get laundered somehow. So, you have to spend it in order to keep those markets up, right? This $46 billion isn't just going to, an apparition in the sky. These are being awarded as contracts. These are then going into big companies that are building this stuff. And so the money is being used to generate or excuse me, not generate, but to drive an economy in a way that they want to see it move. When it comes to now what our mayor over here, Mamdani, wants us to do, he could have said, again, it's a heads I win, tails you lose. He could have said, everyone put your thermostat at 32 degrees and let's have a pool party. And they would have said, oh, communism, he wants to spend money, right? On the other end, he wants people to save money. It's communism. It's a lose-lose game. And so what do you do with those kind of situations? You do what Mamdani continues to do. Ignore them as best as you can and keep showing up for the people that elected you. And there's no reason to kind of go play in the mud with them because you're not going to win. All you do is get dirty.
Yeah, all you do is get dirty. But, in the meantime, the surveillance state is growing before our very eyes. Is there anything about how surveillance infrastructure is getting normalized I should say the pace at which surveillance infrastructure is getting normalized. What about that should we be concerned about? I mean, we're only 2 years into the second term of Trump, and it feels like 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the idea of surveillance, right, we often think of it as um, numbers on a screen, riddled with zeros and ones. But the surveillance state can be marked all the way to the colonial period, right? Some of the earliest colonial laws that restricted Black and Indigenous movement were things like the Lantern Laws, in which Black folks and Indigenous folks in New York City had to quite literally carry lanterns to illuminate their faces at night. Otherwise, they could be summoned to a fine or some other kind of punishment. And so that's what really starts it. And now we're to this point where there's facial recognition software and AI technologies that can create images and things like that. And where the real tensions lie is not necessarily in the nefarious aspect of it, but the convenience part of it, right? For many of us, we buy into the AI because it creates a useful tool in our everyday lives, or it creates a convenience. If you have an iPhone or some other smart device and you're using the facial recognition software that opens your phone without having to type in your password, that's a huge convenience, right? But at the same time, that can only happen through the biometric data that they've collected on you. And now is being the question you have to ask is, where is that data being stored, and what else can they or are they going to use it? I mean, I don't think I think we're past the point of kind of questioning if they'll use it, but kind of the question of how they'll use it moving forward in the future. And that can be across kind of the surveillance of our movement and restriction, but it's also, we're seeing it in forms of entertainment, with music, with movies, where they're creating actors and actresses and songs that are completely made of AI. And so it kind of makes us think of, where does our own labor go? How do we then pay for, or pay for things that, if we're not going to be hired because they're going to use this data software that they've created? And so we are really living at a moment in which we have to kind of figure out, where do we push back? How do we push back? And what do we want to keep of it, and what do we want to toss into you know the the outer spaces of our world and get rid of?
And this is why guardrails are so important. You hear folks at least give lip service to the fact that we need federal guardrails, we need state and local guardrails that govern the use of AI technology, that govern where these data centers are allowed to go up, and what the rules of the road are. We saw it just right outside of Los Angeles in Monterey Park, first city in the nation to ban data centers from being built within their city limits. And so, that gets me to this idea of what the ideological threat really is. Folks on the right like to say, well, concepts like mutual aid and conservation, they look at those as ideological threats, when in fact the ideological threat is really something else. What would you call it?
Well, the existential threat is that fascism wants to remove us, right? And they want to have this sort of barbarism in which we, the masses, are kind of left out of this club that we have to fend for ourselves. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that highlights that mutual aid actually works, right? I think one of the most notable examples in U.S. history is the Breakfast for Children program that was started by the Black Panthers in California in the mid to late 1960s, where the Black Panthers, right, identified a problem that little children in the, ghettos across America were going to school hungry. And if you're hungry, you're not going to pay attention. You're not going to do well, and you might lash out. Well, every child in America today, still, God willing, is fed through a federal funded program that feeds children across schools. The federal government didn't come to that because of some kind of altruistic, we think it's going to work. They did it because there was a pressure applied by grassroots organizations like the Black Panthers, and it was essentially, one could say, co-opted by the federal government so they could control the reins of it. The fact that I think it was Ronald Reagan, his famous quote that ketchup packages counted as a fruit and vegetable dish. But still, right, the fact that there's even food that is accessible is really important. And so what we're seeing, and that's what they argue, right? That's the argument that they'll make is if you're against AI, then you're against convenience. You're against working people, because who doesn't want their Amazon package in 2 days? That's not simply because of Amazon delivery workers, shout out to them, but it's the algorithms that are putting together where packages need to go, which distribution center, what the route is, what time. I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure that's built into that. But if we could all say maybe having that gift in 3 days versus 2 days can actually save us a bit. I remember, I'm sure you do too, Dr. Nee, going through literal magazines when growing up, and you circled what you wanted, and then hoping mom would order it, and then a couple weeks you had to take, right? That was we moved at a pace in which we understood, and now we are moving at such a rapid pace. It is literally destroying our planet, and these oligarchs are willing to continue to drain our resources, whether they're natural or otherwise.
OMG, Professor Smiley, you're taking me down memory lane. You're making me think of Teddy Ruxpin. I was a kid, and there was a year where all I wanted for Christmas was a Teddy Ruxpin. And for some of the Gen Z folks who have no clue what I'm talking about, just go ahead and Google Teddy Ruxpin. You'll see a little talking bear, right? And that year I got a talking Big Bird, right? And never got that Teddy Ruxpin, but you're right. Once upon a time, we didn't have the same conveniences that we have today. That have us in a chokehold, quite frankly. I mean, even when we think about Ring cameras, and there's been plenty of reporting around Ring camera footage being shared with local law enforcement, right? And so I know that I know from my own experience. Let's just put it that way, because we are on the air. I ain't gonna talk about business, right? But I know it's something that, we discussed at length in my household in terms of comfort level around, cameras, how many cameras, where they are, that sort of thing. And it was very uncomfortable for me because I understand this expansion of the surveillance state. And I think we all get to choose how we're going to participate, but you got to balance that out with, sometimes some real concerns.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, I think that goes back to it, right? I mean, we all would like, I mean, that's why we have locks on our doors or bars on our windows or keys to open those doors, is that we all want to feel safe in where we rest our heads. And so these surveillance technologies like Ring camera and others are premised as that safety net, right? But it is the kind of more nefarious how they're then doing these kind of wider net spreads of linking your camera to another camera, which you're like, did I sign up for that? Did I sign up that they could go in there? And the fact is, you did, because the moment you hit agree, right, on all the apps that you download, it says it in there. And so, but who's going? And it becomes again one of the you kind of can't opt out of it, right? On when you download an app, if you don't hit agree, you can't use the app. So it's not really like it's carte blanche. You could say, well, I don't want to do this, but I want this part of it. It's a wholesale, right? And then there's other apps like the Citizens app and other apps that are premised as ways to keep your community safe. But those things, especially people who are on them a lot, you start to feel scared. But that's what they want you to do, because if you feel scared, right, then they can institute policies that then could further their agenda. So it doesn't matter that across the United States, large cities have seen record lows in homicide. New York, Baltimore, Detroit, etc. It's I still feel unsafe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why do you still feel unsafe? Well, if you watch your local news, it's only riddled with unsafe things. And so that becomes the point in which politicians or reactionary pundits and whoever can capitalize on that and say, oh, that's why we need these things. That's why we need more surveillance. That's why we need them to look at your eyeballs and get those biometrics. And it's being used against people, right? We just saw in Texas, a bunch of activists just got 30 to 100 years, and using that kind of surveillance footage to convict them.
Dr. Smiley, in our remaining minute, I want to give you an opportunity to reflect on America 250. We are just a couple days away.
Sorry.
The 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of our leaders, learners, and listeners, have mixed feelings about this moment. In about a minute, how are you feeling today?
There's a meme that I usually share every 4th of July, and it's a picture of Black folks in the cotton field, and someone's written across it, this is what my ancestors were doing on July 4th, 1776. So, I also think about that, and I also think about Frederick Douglass's famous speech, "What is 4th of July to a slave?" in which this is a holiday that is often seen as a time for revelment and partying, but it's supposed to also be seen as a time of reflection on freedoms and liberties. And if you are looking like you and me, Dr. Nii, that is not what we do, right? And so I don't have much positive to say. If you're looking for a positive note, this is not one where I will give it.
No, we're looking for honesty. We're looking for honesty.
And I think we're also in a moment where, we're being led by an authoritarian fascist who is we're going to celebrate a country that is about liberty and individualism and freedom, while the highest in our land is actively trying to take people's citizenship away. Right? Birthright citizenship is on the table. That is a core foundation of what we might think of as America. Because again, that is not something that's universal across the globe. Many countries don't have that. But the United States does. And, for all the bad that the U.S. has, and there's plenty to go around, that is a shining glimmer in the U.S. history to have that. And so to see a government trying to take that away, what is there to celebrate? What are we celebrating? What are we doing?
Yeah. Our thanks to Professor Calvin John Smiley for joining us here. You can always check him out at cjsmiley.com. Enjoy your holiday weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. You too, Dr. Nii.
More when we come forward.